everybody does this who's engaged in getting better at whatever they do. They will rehearse the course now, or rehearse the act enough times that once they can concept the whole thing to its completion, and they get out of that think box, then the think box is so important because we have to review our act. We have to repeat it enough times. And the act of mental rehearsal really installs the neurological hardware in your brain. It primes the brain so you have circuits to use. Now, mental rehearsal also changes the body. You can take a group of men and have them imagine or rehearse doing bicep curls for an hour a day for 2 weeks, and add an emotional component called stronger, harder, more intense. And for 1 hour, they practice in their mind doing those curls. At the end of 2 weeks, there's a 13.5 increase in muscle strength. They never lifted a weight. Their body's changing by thought alone. So the person who's priming their brain and body through rehearsal, when they get in their play box, there's no thinking. They're just doing. There's just the act. In fact, the thought of what they're doing becomes the experience. They get lost in the act, and their analytical facilities, their analytical mind is out of the way, and they can sustain a state where nothing in their environment is going to move them from this state. They're in the feeling of what it would feel like to play well, and they hold on to that feeling. And when the conditions get tense, they actually do something different. They self-regulate, and they actually crave this moment of performance to be able to produce an outcome. And so there's no mysticism to this. It's just what people do when they get really into something is that we rehearse all the time. So but people understand if you take a group of people that never played the piano before and you teach them one-handed scales and chords and they come and practice for 2 hours a day for 5 days, at the end of 5 days, if you do a brain scan before and after, they'll grow circuits on the opposite side of the brain. No magic there. You learn something new. Learning's making new connections. You get your body involved. You get some instruction. You have an experience. Experience enriches the circuits. Repeat it over and over again, fire and wire, and pay attention and stay present. You'll assemble new neurological circuitry. Take another group of people, have them close their eyes, and actually have them mentally rehearse playing the scales and chords for 2 hours a day for 5 days. Scan their brain before and after, and at the end of 5 days, their brain will look like they've been playing the piano for 5 days, but they never lifted a finger. The brain literally changed through the rehearsal. Okay, so now take the person and put them in front of a piano. They've never played the piano before. And they could actually play those scales and chords like the people who are actually physically demonstrating it. So what does that have to do for the single mother of 3 children? What does that have to do with the person who's trying to heal a health condition? It's not enough to just have a good meditation and get up and spend the rest of your day reacting and responding to the conditions in your life. That's 1 hour of living or conditioning your body and brain into the future against 15 hours of you responding emotionally from your past. So we got to rehearse, okay, how am I going to be in this situation? How am I going to change? What would love do today? What would greatness look like? It's those frontal lobe questions that actually begins to install the circuitry, and we all do it naturally. The only time we don't do it is when we're living in stress and we're living in survival. Why? Because it's not a time to create. It's not a time to learn. It's not a time to go inward. It's not a time to dream. It's a time to run, fight, and hide. And if you're spending the majority of your time in the arousal of those stress hormones, then most people their senses become heightened, they narrow their focus, and now they're engaged in doing anything they can, relying on something outside of them to take away that feeling. So if people begin to understand that they actually can change, and they understand a formula to do it, and they practice that formula and they rehearse it, both by mentally rehearsing it and actually participating in it, the effects should be in the experiment that something should change either in your body or in your life, and that's why we do it. So when you see the changes or the synchronicities or the coincidences or the opportunities starting to show up in your life, you're going to pay attention to what you did and you're going to do it again. And many people who have chronic health conditions that just get beyond those thoughts and those habits and those emotions that keep them as that same personality. and begin to think, act, and feel differently, notice dramatic changes in their health and in their biology. And we have the data to suggest that people who do this for 7 days, their body looks like genetically and biologically they're in a different life. Their body is no longer responding in the same way, and they're no longer victims to their environment because they can self-regulate. There tends to be a greater resistance to anything in their environment, even on a microscopic level.
A lot of this is a complete paradigm shift for the current way most of society is and the way modern society is kind of taught, whether it be at school or university. We talk, if I talk through the lens of a medical doctor and looking at the health of my patients, for many years I have said that, listen, we're missing lots of key skills as medical doctors because, what we've learned can be really good for acute problems and emergency situations, but it doesn't tend to work so well for these chronic conditions that didn't happen overnight, that they have developed because of our lifestyle. And I've said many times in the media over the last few years that about 80% of what we see is in some way connected to our collective modern lifestyles. I'm not putting blame on people. I'm just saying it's the way we are living these days is leading to not just things like obesity, type 2 diabetes, but also anxiety, depression, migraines, gut problems, low libido, whatever this barrage of problems we're now seeing as doctors is. But I've got to say, over the last few years, I've been wondering, well, yes, I still maintain that's the case, and I still want to make and help people make those lifestyle changes. But actually, I've realized it's not the root cause. It's not, I can go further upstream. Yes, lifestyle is important. If I can help people change, yes, it changes their downstream consequences on their health. But the way we think, our mental well-being, our happiness, I have actually come to the conclusion over last year, so that's even more important than lifestyle, because if we change the way we think and approach the world and respond to people and external events rather than, unconsciously reacting, well, that creates a new environment in our body where we naturally make better lifestyle choices. In fact, those lifestyle choices no longer feel like an effort, because a lot of the time, those lifestyle behaviors are simply a way for us to manage the stress in our lives. Would you how would you see that? Do you agree with that? Do you have a different perspective? I'm just very, very interested to hear your thoughts.
No, I absolutely agree with it. I absolutely do. And I think that the one thing, if it took you 5 years of living in chronic stress and what are the emotions of stress and survival? Aggression, anger, hatred, competition, judgment, insecurity, envy, jealousy, pain, suffering, guilt, shame, fear, anxiety, depression, hopelessness, powerlessness. Those are all derived from the hormones of stress, and psychology calls the normal human states of consciousness. Those are altered states of consciousness. And so then if you're living in emergency and your response to your coworker, to your boss, to the traffic, to the news, to whatever it is, weakens the organism, and you're switching on that emergency system over time. No organism can live in emergency mode for an extended period of time. You're drawing from the body's vital resources, and you're converting all of its energy into chemistry for some threat, real or imagined. Okay, so then if you keep doing that in chronic conditions, there's no energy for growth and repair. There's no energy for long-term building projects. The immune system dials down. The digestive system becomes out of phase. Hormones change. Our cardiovascular system changes. Our respiratory system changes. This is because the body is believing it's living in a dangerous environment, okay? So the problem then becomes that the arousal of these stress hormones that create fear, that create anger, aggression, or create pain, give the body a rush of energy. Now, people become almost like an addict. They need the problems in their life to reaffirm their addiction to that arousal, to that emotion.
Yeah.
And now, if you can turn that response on by thought alone, number one, you become addicted to your own thoughts. And number two, you become addicted to the very life, the life that you don't even like.
Yeah.
So then you ask the person, why are you this way? And they'll say, I am this way because of this event that happened to me 5 years ago. Well, what that really means is they had some really profoundly emotional experience. And the stronger the emotion we feel, the more altered we feel inside of us, the more we pay attention to what causes it. And the brain freezes a frame and takes a snapshot. And that's called the long-term memory. And so then that person then is altered biologically from that trauma, from that event. And what they don't know is every time they remember the event, they're producing the same chemistry in their brain and body as if the event was occurring. Okay, well, then you tell the person, why are you this way? Well, then they'll tell the story about how it happened. And the research on memory says that 50% of that story, the way you recount it, is actually not accurate. It's actually not the truth. That people don't have the same brain, so they embellish the story to excuse themselves from changing. And if they make it more difficult or they add more components to it, then now they'll reaffirm their identity in being a certain way. That story becomes very important to them. And they believe it, they behave it as it, and they ultimately become it. And so then can you use those same principles and begin to start to manage your inner world? And by regulating, taking the time before you start your day and say, okay, before I grab my cell phone, before I get up and run through my routine, my automatic routine where people are on automatic pilot and a habituation of what they did yesterday, and their body's dragging them into the same predictable future based on what they did in the past, and they've lost their free will to choose, to become conscious to a set of automatic programs. Well, if the familiar past is the known and the predictable future is the known, there's only one place where the unknown exists, and that's the sweet spot of the present moment. So if you said, okay, let me get present here. Let me remind myself of those thoughts I don't want to think. Let me remind myself of the behaviors I want to change. Let me review in my mind the emotions that caused me to move to a lower denominator. Let me become so conscious of that I won't go unconscious again. Let me remind myself who I do want to be, how I do want to think, how I do want to act, how I do want to feel. And let me see if I can get so good at doing this with my eyes closed when I start my day that I can do it with my eyes open. Now, this river of change, people say, I can't predict my future. Well, the best way to predict it is to create it, not in the known, but in the unknown. So our research shows that if you teach a person to go a little further than where they normally stop, when they get uncomfortable, they quit and reach for their cell phone, or they say, I'm busy, got too much to do. If you get people present, really, and you teach them how to stretch a little further, and they get beyond that known, and there's no danger, there's no threat, there's no survival, the body actually begins to relax into the present moment. And when that happens, we see this over and over again. Energy moves right into the heart. And now the heart, all of a sudden, starts to beat with more order, more coherence. The autonomic nervous system is no longer dysregulated from stress. It's starting to organize, and this feeling feels right? So then if you can sustain that state, independent of the conditions in your environment, then you're mastering your environment. You're mastering your life.
If you enjoyed that clip from my podcast, here's another powerful clip that is really going to help you with your health and happiness.
I'm on a mission to get every human being to add one thing to their morning routine. This takes 5 days to work before you have an enormous breakthrough in how you see and relate to yourself.